This review and analysis of Star Trek Picard Episode 8 Broken Pieces contains full spoilers. The link to the playlist with my videos for the other episodes is in the description. The opening flashback recap is probably the most revelatory thing we've seen for some time. Oh is leading some black-clad Romulan women who are the Zhat Vash stood around a neon-looking table frame kind of thing, among whom are Narissa and the de-assimilated mythological expert lady from all the way back in episode 3, who we learn is also Narissa's aunt. They all grab the frame and are subject to a rapid montage of synth-induced destruction and the rest, like Jurati's mind meld vision in the previous episode. For all except Narissa, this leads to various suicides and self-harming. One shoots herself in the head, another claws at the skin on her own face, and another bashes her own head in with a rock. It's an extreme reaction, but then I did go through similar when I attempted to watch Star Trek Discovery. While visions of a horrible future that drive people suicidally mad are a daft cliche, and we the audience don't glimpse anything remotely approaching the Lovecraftian menace that would be required to justify the reactions, I do like that this scene humanises Narissa a little as she quietly turns to Oh and says they have to stop them. It's undermined perhaps by the fact that she's been nothing other than a wicked witch pantomime villain, taking glee in her evil doings so far in the show. It's conceivable that resolve in the rightness of her mission might have hardened her attitude, but we only ever see her go about her dastardly deeds with relish, and we'll see it again in this episode when it comes to the Borg. If we do try to set aside that contradiction, then the message comes through that the Zhat Vash really are acting with the intent of a greater good. The virtue of that intent is further undermined of course by the Oh then says they're going to target Mars, where we know the armada to assist the Romulan refugees was amassing. You wonder how much horror they're seeing in this vision when they'll do something so destructive to their own people, rather than launch the attack after the ships have left. It would still quite possibly have achieved the aim of getting the Federation to ban simps, you would think. The blurb for the episode on Amazon Prime said that devastating truths behind the Mars attack are revealed, but finding out that the Zhat Vash did it isn't much of a twist. My original guess from a while back was that the Zhat Vash caused the Mars Synth Rebellion not only because it would lead to the Federation's ban, but also as the destroyed Armada would be a punishment on their own people, perhaps regarding the supernova that destroyed Romulus as already a punishment on them for dabbling in synth technology, which I thought maybe they had. Whether that's any good or not is of course opinion, but it is a more complex motivation than that the people who we've known since episode 2 have hated simps are the ones who did the attack that got the simps banned. Now it's just that the Zhat Vash didn't care about their own race as much as they do about getting that ban, the harm to their fellow Romulans being collateral damage rather than intent. The late-stage attempt to humanise Narissa continues as we cut to the present day and she talks to her unconscious ex-Borg aunt at her bedside. It seems the reason the artifact was cut off from the collective was because Auntie XB in particular was assimilated and she had in her mind all the madness of the neon frame vision, which the Borg couldn't handle. This is making some big promises about what exactly the full contents of the vision were. There are echoes of I, Borg in this as well, where Geordi hatched a plan to send Hugh back with a mind virus to deal a blow to the Borg. They opted against it because it would be cruel to Hugh, but it turned out the real mind virus which led to many Borg being cut off was Hugh's newfound individuality. As for the nature of the glowing lightsaber table thing, which the Zhat Vash call the admonition, as per the now standard and quite un-Romulan pretension of the new mystical aspects, it remains to be seen whether it will be further explained and justified or remain a magic MacGuffin. Oh says it's the last thing left behind by the former civilization of the planet Aya, and that could be the best we get. Aya's part of the 8-star system, which Rafi makes a fuss about later, and so we can't rule out a better explanation down the line. With that said, it's not like we got a good origin for the Guardian of Forever, and people love that episode. We next get the answers to last week's Fenris Ranger's emergency button keyring discovery. It wasn't just any old place that Elnor found it, it was actually in Hugh's old office, so we can extrapolate that Hugh told him about it just in case, which tidies that mystery up kind of. Though last week's scene of Elnor seeing the keyring dangling in front of him and slowly reaching for it sure made it look like he just discovered it. To test our credulity again, as the Romulans on the cube find Elnor and come in for a fight, 7 of 9 bursts in soon after to help, conveniently meaning the Fenris Ranger on call was the only one Elnor had met. In episode 6, Elnor popped up in the nick of time to cut down some Romulan guards and save Picard, but at least he was in transporter range anyway, unlike 7 who had to come who knows how far to arrive at just that right moment. 7's return of course inclines me to be forgiving, because her appearance in Stardust City Rag was by far the highlight of Star Trek Picard so far, but we'd also just had a scene of multiple Romulan guards opting for hand-to-hand combat rather than using their guns being taken out by Elnor, all while he'd just been flash grenaded as well. He'd have made a heck of an unlockable character in Nightfire. After that though, there's an unexpectedly tender moment as Elnor gives 7 a great big needy hug. It does make a lot of sense though for Elnor to do that, and not just because he gets to hug Jerry Ryan. Because he grew up without parents and also felt additional abandonment when Picard stopped visiting. Despite his over-the-top combat ability, being trapped alone and hunted on a dark ship after his only friend there died in his arms must have stirred up a lot of his psychological weaknesses, and so the older and seemingly in control 7 showing up to help him probably imbues her in his eyes with the feeling of parental security that he'd lacked in his childhood. Post-titles, and on La Serena, no one's getting along. Rios is freaked out by Soji, whereas Raffi is merely mistrustful on the grounds that the last friend Picard brought on board was Jurati, who was tracked by the Romulans and killed Maddox, which Picard won't accept at first even though the emergency medical hologram tells him as much. Picard gets on the holographic dog and bone to the foul-mouthed old Admiral woman from back in episode 2 to brag that he got Soji without her help, and to demand a squadron meet him at Deep Space 12 to help him defend the planet of the synths from the Romulans. She obliges, but not before making sure she gets to be the one to use the first F word of the episode at him, and they're certainly not rationing themselves on those this week. Still, it'll be nice to finally see some Starfleet ships at last. We unfortunately get multiple scenes featuring the Rios holograms, particularly unfortunate as it begins with the worst of the bunch, the Mrs. Brown's Boys one. Raffi, despite having spent a couple of episodes now being drunk and moping, somehow knows that the XP Romulans on the artifact have been drawing 8 looped circles. She says it caught her eye while surveilling the cube, which is a catastrophic making sense failure, as even if she hadn't been blind drunk since Free Cloud, how could she have seen that? The navigation hologram recognises it as probably meaning a group of 8 stars like we saw near the planet in the Jar Vash opening flashback, because what else could 8 circles mean? In fairness, he is the navigation hologram, so it's in his nature to look for these patterns. It's a huge bit of luck then that Raffi had this conversation with him, considering she originally thought she was talking to the actual Rios. The Conclave of 8 has of course been mentioned a grand total of once in the past 7 episodes, which is deep foreshadowing by this show's usual standard of just suddenly introducing important things out of nowhere. She continues her information fetch quest by talking to the other Rios holograms around the ship. The next one is a Scottish engineer one I don't remember seeing previously. Making the engineer Scottish is obviously a nod to Scotty, but the actor's Scottish accent is so bad that Mel Gibson would be ashamed of it, never mind Jimmy Doohan. After a couple of episodes of Raffi moping, it's now Rios' turn. He was referenced as having some difficult Starfleet past in the first episode in which he appeared, which has hardly been mentioned again since, but we see him sitting on the floor in his room going through an old box, among which is what appears to be a sketch of him with Soji or Daj, which indicates that there's actually more synths that look like them than just the twins. Rafi gathers all 5 of the Rios holograms together to try to find out what's up with him, and it turns out they're the titular broken pieces, as between their individual characters you can supposedly make a whole Rios, except it turns out you can't anyway, and she just gets what she wanted to know from the man directly later, making all of this pointless. It's a shame because I'd hoped the broken pieces would be something more interesting than the same actor doing 5 different stupid accents to tell us something about the guy who's hardly risen above the status of background character before this, an arrangement with which I was personally quite content. The 5 holograms scene is long, attemptedly quirky and not particularly funny, but the upshot is that we only get a recapitulation of things mentioned already, either in this episode or about 4 episodes ago, but no actual answer. Something happened on Rios's Starfleet ship, the Ibn Majid, which is classified, but his captain there killed himself, and there was a girl who looks like Soji and Daj, but was called Jana. This scene was a massive stall just for the sake of showing the annoying holograms together at once, and worse still, when Rios finally explains the whole thing, the explanation includes the fragments we just heard anyway. For our purposes, the gaps that includes are that his old captain made first contact with an ambassador in Jana, but then killed them on orders from Starfleet under the threat of destruction of the Ibn Majid if he refused. The captain then killed himself when Rios lost his rag at him over it, and then Rios covered it all up. You would think this suggests a high level of Zhat Vash infiltration into Starfleet, but Commodore Oh and her alone is named as the culprit. She's been getting away with some pretty obvious and awful things then, but though it's unlikely, it's better than the alternative that there's widespread collaboration in this, because Gene Roddenberry's optimistic vision of Starfleet and their moral core would be firmly dead and buried if so. There would be no need for Section 31, because Section 31 would be the norm. Over on the artifact, Seven, being a former Borg, gains access to the Queen Cell and starts throwing the holographic controls around that seem to switch the cube on. Elnor may be a skilled fighter, but he's also a dimwit, as he left the Fenris Rangers plastic bat signal lying around in Hugh's office with the Romulan guards he's just bumped off, alerting Narissa as to Seven's presence, because she's seen the previous episodes and knows Seven's the only Ranger we're actually going to see. Seven's potential solution is to awaken the drones who are in stasis and have yet to be de-Borgified into XBs to battle the Romulans, and to create a link between herself and them, effectively forming a mini-collective so they can understand and coordinate. The cost of this is their freedom to act individually in the immediate term, and it's not a bad dilemma as things go, as it's also implied Seven would become a de facto queen herself in doing it, which of course she's uncomfortable with. Unfortunately, the whole attempt is abortive because the Romulans blast all the drones into the vacuum of space, which would have come as a big shock, except they said about half an hour earlier that that was what they were going to do, and so the tension was pretty much absent from the cube scenes, and just amounted to Jerry Ryan waving her arms in the air and for some reason having black eyes and a funny voice for a bit while she's plugged in. This isn't the first time Borg drones have been dealt with by ejecting them into space as it happens. Voyager did the same thing in Scorpion Part 2. Picard wakes up Jurati, and we learn that the vision of O's and the Zhat Vash isn't of the future, but of 200,000 years ago, and the worry is it is about to happen again. After that we get a very annoying scene of a wide-eyed Jurati gormlessly being amazed when Soji tells her that she eats and drinks. It makes it even better news that she's going to turn herself in for the murder of Maddox when they get to DS-12. So far as the vision goes, the past equivalent being the origin of the Borg could make it a suicide-inducing vision of hell, I should think. It's the only thing with consequences that have been that far-reaching. Indeed, I think that's pretty much how long the Borg have been implied to have been around for previously, though that was tempered, which may be a kind way of saying contradicted, by the Voyager episode Dragon's Teeth, which informed us that the Borg had only assimilated a handful of systems by the 15th century. The one thing working against the Borg hypothesis, it seems to me, is that a vision of their own origin in the mind of Narissa's aunt would be what caused the artifact to be cut off from the collective. Could their origins really be so horrible that the Borg themselves are that shocked by them? How past events give the Zhat Vash a new prophecy of a coming destroyer, and that being Soji, remains to be seen. I'll be interested to know as well how this new synth planet ties in with the events from centuries ago, unless it's really just meant to be a prior example of a civilization reaching the AI singularity as a warning for the potential of history to repeat, though it would seem to be deeper than that. Soji had knowledge of the Borg Queen's transporter in episode 6, and in this episode she knows how to access their transwarp network, which she rationalises as probably being knowledge she picked up on the cube, which has the ring of being obviously untrue because only Hugh was aware of the transporter, and if knowledge of how to access and use the Borg transwarp conduits was freely available from the artifact, the Romulans would be utilising them. This makes it more likely that not only is this story definitely about Borg stuff, but I think that there will be some time-based jargon involved too. In fact, back at the end of episode 6 I noted how the Borg transporter in the Queen cell seemed like it would fill in the blank of the Borg Queen surviving the best of both worlds to appear again in First Contact, but that a line was put in for not much reason that specifically rules that out. The old explanation was just the Borg Queen chiding Picard that he thinks in three-dimensional terms, implying she has powers beyond the limits of time and space. Put that together and perhaps Soji, as the destroyer prophesied by the Romulan mystics, is a future Borg Queen, and her useful knowledge now is an echo from her own future. I'm not terribly keen on the idea. Data's daughter becomes the Borg Queen is fanfic level small universe stuff, but with what we've learned there is a logic to it. Assuming the Borg Queen really does operate on a pan-dimensional level though, assuming a non-deterministic universe, it could be a choice Soji has that she rejects making, meaning she doesn't become a Borg Queen, but the future being a potentiality means those bits of knowledge helpfully come to her in the past. That the Borg are tapped into destiny might also be hinted at in that when Seven was hooked into the Borg cube before disconnecting, she said in her deep Borg voice, "Annika still has work to do." This is wild speculation at this point, I know, but if I don't get my predictions in now, I never will. There is one further link between the Borg and the synths, which is that Bruce Maddox was funded by Bjayzl, whose main operation that we see was harvesting Borg parts. Jurati in Remembrance thought a sentient flesh and blood android was 1,000 years away, so perhaps Borg technology from Bjayzl was required to get Maddox's project to work. There would be some poetry in this. It was, after all, the Borg Queen who tried to tempt Data by giving him flesh and blood. Soji hijacks La Sirena and uses her knowledge of the Borg transwarp network to get them to the synth planet ahead of the Romulans, who despite having known about the planet for 2 episodes, only now launch their fleet. This of course means we don't get to see Deep Space 12 or the squadron assembled for Picard, at least in this episode, meaning it's 8 episodes now of a Star Trek show where we have yet to see a single Starfleet ship in the show's present. Even more disappointing, neither will Jurati be offloaded to the authorities. Regarding the Romulans, they were able to identify the planet in Soji's dream from just the 2 red moons and electrical storms, so it is a known planet and not hidden. It's just that they had no idea Timps had been there for 14 years, which is when Bruce Maddox went there after the synth ban. If Maddox is known to have been on the synth world building synths, why did Oh get Jurati to kill him rather than find out its location from him? That was at the end of episode 5, and it's not until the end of episode 6 that Narek and Narissa figure it out from Soji's dream. Oh should have got Jurati to try to find out from Maddox rather than killing the one person that's been there. This situation about there being other synths that look like Dahj and Soji would seem to ruin the impetus for the whole show kicking off from Remembrance, that Dahj had a necklace indicating she was one of a pair of twins created together, which sent Picard off on his search to find the other one. Now maybe Jurati was reading too much into an old rule about creation in pairs that isn't as hard and fast as they thought, despite the necklace, but then Maddox affirmed that Dahj had the one twin when he told Picard about Soji, and pre-activated Soji was aware of herself having one sister. It can't be that other earlier synths existed that had the same appearance, but it's Dahj and Soji that were created with Data's positron, making them uniquely Data's daughters, because Data's painting daughter indicated that their appearance came from him as well, so Jana was his daughter. daughter. It must be that others of the same appearance and therefore from Data's positron were created, perhaps many others, but it's only the Darge and Soji pair that were sent off-world by Maddox. There's a gap of 6 years between the Mars attack, which marked the point at which Maddox disappeared to go and work on what would become the synth planet, and the Ibn Majid incident, so it does all hold together. The only real thing that's taken a hit is Picard thinking he was saving Data's only daughter when there could be plenty more out there, depending on how swiftly Maddox worked and just how many synths are on his planet now. The Ibn Majid incident raises questions too. Rios said the Ibn Majid picked up a diplomatic mission out of nowhere to encounter a small unknown ship, and they made first contact and beamed aboard its only 2 people, one of whom was Jana and the other was named Beautiful Flower. On the one hand, picking up a mission is an odd turn of phrase for just running across a ship, which would seem to imply there was an instruction from Starfleet to check out this ship who was nearby to them, but on the other hand they had to tell Starfleet it was a first contact situation, and only then the captain got the order to kill them. Beautiful Flower is called an ambassador, which would seem to indicate this was somewhat pre-arranged, though it doesn't make sense that Starfleet engineered a first contact with people they don't know the homeworld of, so perhaps he was just a de facto ambassador given the situation. Or maybe this was actually the synth's attempt to make first contact. What's more, this took place in the Vate sector, which is in fact the same sector as the synth world, making it all the stranger Oh didn't know where the planet was before Narek found out from Soji. If this encounter was engineered by Starfleet, then she must have known, and if it wasn't, then the location where this all went down was a major clue she should have followed up on. Enough was known though that Rios' captain got the order from Starfleet to kill them. As with offing Bruce Maddox, killing the 2 simps was hopelessly short-sighted because it meant they wouldn't find out where they came from and meant they'd have to end up waiting another 9 years. What happened to the small ship the synths were on, we don't know. As Rios was tasked with covering up the whole incident, the Ibn Majid probably didn't tow it back, and nor is it likely he had it destroyed, as that would be tough to pull off without the rest of the crew noticing. Maybe Oh's people would have recovered it later, but unlike other ships we've ever seen, there was no way of determining its origin from its logs. It's not as though Beautiful Flower and Jana themselves would have been keeping things deleted or encrypted on there out of caution, considering how they happily beamed over to the Ibn Majid not expecting to be killed. And again, their planet of origin is in that same sector anyway, so it's hardly something they would think they should make a point of hiding in the ship's computer. Anyway, this whole Ibn Majid thing is my guess for the opening flashback of one of the next 2 episodes. The only machine planet mentioned before in Star Trek that I can think of is the one V'Ger was sent back from in the motion picture. Considering what it became, a cloud so vast it was double the distance between the Earth and the Sun with everything it had encountered catalogued within, and which considered living people to be a biological infestation on the Enterprise. As Star Trek's greatest eldritch abomination, you could consider that both nightmarish and conceptually congruous, so I wonder whether that might tie in. V'Ger's existential crisis paralleling Soji asking Jurati whether she's a person means it feels almost too similar not to, but it would also preclude the old machine planet of centuries past being the Borg without additional time travel stuff, and the evidence discussed earlier means the Borg are still my primary theory. The questions can go on, but the hope is we're about to get some conclusive answers. After 8 episodes of little happening, things did here insofar that we've at least had big parts of the plot explained to us. It is all telling rather than showing, but when a show's so based around uncovering past events, that's perhaps all it can be. In explaining large parts of the plot, it's a step up in that way from most of the show's episodes that consist of only having small parts of the plot explained to us. Even here, how much of it is new information rather than a consolidation of previous threads is up for debate, but at least we're forming a picture now. What remains is to see how they fill in the blanks and if they can deliver any surprises while doing it. But I can say this is only the 2nd or 3rd time that I've been really interested to see the next episode. I do like these revelations for the underlying complexity and questions it makes us ask. It's given us things to think about and turn over. The worry is that we won't get enough to to show us how these things fit together entirely, and that it will only be just enough to fulfill the needs of the plot, but not answer the lingering questions. That we've had a late rush of exposition here in episode 8 out of 10 means, unfortunately, I think that worry's probably justified. We've yet to even get onto the synth planet, and we've only a fifth of the show left to finish the whole story. Broken Pieces is hurt by the amount of coincidence it relies on. There's always been coincidences in Star Trek, whether it be that the Enterprise D were the ones who found Scotty in transporter stasis, or that in all the vastness of the Delta Quadrant, Voyager ran into the Voth City ship, whose inhabitants were the descendants of an evolved offshoot of a dinosaur species which left Earth millions of years ago, and later they also ran into a lone Klingon ship of cultists who thought Torres' unborn child would be their messiah. Sometimes these things are necessary for a story to exist, other times they're laziness. For example, last week I was appalled that they gave Riker and Troy a dead son who'd had such a contrived plot-related disease which was unnecessary to the story and was just invented to give us a case of a negative impact from the banning of synths. Well, this week, not only was Seven the Fenris Ranger who answered Elnor's emergency, but she arrived at just the right moment to save him from the attacking Romulans. Elsewhere, the one Romulan XB who really had any real story way back in episode 3 turned out to be Narissa's aunt who brought her and Narek up. And most convenient of all, the man responsible for driving his captain to guilty suicide and then covering up the whole Ibn Majid incident involving a synth identical to Soji is the man whose ship and expertise Picard hired. I could go on, but I think this is illustrative. I mentioned how Data's daughter becoming a Borg queen is a sort of fanfic idea with a narrow focus on central characters and ideas to the detriment of the scale of the universe these people are meant to be inhabiting. But things such as those described already make the universe of Star Trek Picard feel tiny and make these self-referential ideas sound all the more plausible. The show's been guilty of this kind of thing already multiple times, but I don't think so often in a single episode. The other issue with this episode is the restricted number of locations it takes place in. Aside from the teaser on the planet Aya, it's entirely based on La Sirena and the artifact, neither of which are visually interesting, particularly after becoming so familiar to us already. There are several nice CGI scenes in space, and the Romulan fleet leaving also seemed to my ear to have an old original series leitmotif playing over the scene, but it wasn't enough to keep this from feeling like an obvious bottle show, and even then it's an altogether less bright and varied bottle than Star Trek of old used to offer. Perhaps that's part of why I'm looking forward to next week. We're at least going to be somewhere new, after a fairly tedious hour of people sitting around talking on the same ships they've already been sat around talking on for half a dozen episodes. Now we should finally be getting down to the action, I hope. Broken Pieces succeeds then in getting us interested in what will happen next, but it's hardly going to be worth multiple rewatches on its own. Indeed, for the crime of being even more boring than the show's been before, perhaps Broken Pieces might be the worst episode so far. Thank you for listening. Do please like and share if you've enjoyed it, and if you're willing to hear from me again, I'd be very grateful if you'd subscribe. Star Trek Picard will be ending on a 2-parter, even though the whole series is really a 10-part story anyway. But nevertheless, I will be back next week with a review and analysis of Et in Arcadia Ego Part 1. Not only is that Latin of course, but it's also the title of a 17th century painting thought to suggest the presence of death, so I'm sure we're in for something truly deep and not at all pretentious. This is Jonathan from Headhunters Media, and I hope I'll catch you again soon.